Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted to have in this conversation a diplomat who's done pioneering work in India on the change required in global institutions. Ambassador Asoke Mukherjee is one of the pioneering thought leaders who, for a long time, has been writing about his own experiences within the United Nations system and outside as part of India's diplomatic corps on what kind of change is required in international institutions that would better reflect a changing world order. In light of India's successful G20 summit and conversations about change required in the UN and other bodies, I am absolutely delighted that the ambassador has agreed to join me in this conversation to talk about this very important issue. Ambassador, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you, Hindol. Thank you for inviting me. The subject is very interesting and close to my heart.
I want to begin by asking you that Foreign Minister Jaishankar very recently, in fact, also said that many global institutions are past, in a sense, their sell-by date. They do not reflect the contours of the world order that we see. They do not reflect the interest of major countries like India, the fifth largest economy in the world, about to become in the next few years maybe the third largest economy. They do not reflect, in a sense, the African Union and its interests and many others. Talk us through your thoughts on this.
Well, I think that when we look at the institutions that are around us today, we need to just take a step back in time and look at how they came about. And as an Indian, I often feel that we today may not be very aware of the fact that these institutions, which are anchored in the United Nations, were created on the back of a tremendous contribution by India. One is the military contribution, 2.5 million soldiers who actually influenced the outcome of the Second World War and enabled the Allies to create these institutions, a process that began in Washington in 1942 in January, to which India was invited by President Roosevelt. So that's one part. But the other part, which is now coming out slowly in the archival research that's been written about, is the financial contribution as well. The prosecution of the war effort in Asia was underwritten by logistical support given by India from India's own resources. And this was one of the reasons why something called the sterling balance grew to such a huge figure. Academics have now written that the sterling balance that India had, which was held in the United Kingdom, because the logistics of the UK armed forces were all, in a sense, financed by Indian support, were equal to 45% of the Marshall Plan for the reconstruction of Europe. That's a huge figure. And these were not given back. In the process of negotiations when the International Monetary Fund was created, India and Egypt, which was the other country which spent its own resources in supporting the logistics of the war effort, neither India nor Egypt were able to get back the sovereign, the sterling balances from the United Kingdom. And I think that was hidden in history, but today it's come out. So this contribution of India to the process that ended in the victory of the Second World War and ended in the creation of multilateral institutions is one point which I think a lot of Indians would like to remember, because we are not latecomers. We are there from the very beginning. We are stakeholders. And in the literature, we are stakeholders because of one decision, and that is of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States. He invited India to join the Washington Conference in January 1942, which issued the Declaration of United Nations. So we were 26 of us countries at that time. And Girija Shankar Bajpai, who was India's Agent General in the United States, later became the Secretary General of the Foreign Ministry and then Governor of Mumbai, he signed that declaration. So his signature is there on that paper. So I think that that's an important place from where this question needs to be addressed, because we are stakeholders. The second point, of course, is that we were a British colony. And in international law, since 1919, this has been called an anomaly. because how can a colony be equal with sovereign parties in a legal system? But that again is peculiar and sui generis to India. We signed the Treaty of Versailles as a British colony, but we were an equal participant in the Treaty of Versailles again because of the military contribution of to the First World War. So this is something that is there, but between 1945, when the UN Charter was signed, and 1947 August, when India became a dominion and independent in that sense of British rule, the decisions that were taken under the influence of London. And I think that that is an answer to one question which is often asked as to why did India not get a permanent seat in the UN Security Council? Why was India not given a bigger role and so on? The role was taken by the United Kingdom. And it didn't give that role even to Australia or Canada or New Zealand or South Africa, the four dominions. It kept that role closely to itself. And the only time it consulted the dominions was in April 1945, a month before the conference establishing the United Nations was held. And none of the Dominion delegations had any say. And therefore, the first point that is addressed today is about the veto. So when the veto was revealed to the Dominion delegations who met in London in April 1945, it was explained that the veto provision was negotiated outside the Charter, and it would be made conditional for any country wanting to come to San Francisco to negotiate the UN Charter, that they had to accept the veto. And because India was a British colony and the other dominions themselves, none of them were able to convince the United Kingdom that this was not a equal democratic path on which we could go. And therefore, you have a situation in May and June 1945. The delegations of Australia and India are on record objecting to the veto and saying that this is contradictory to the core principle of the UN Charter, one country, one vote. And as a way of bringing these dissenting voices into accepting the UN Charter, which is a treaty, an article is given to them, Article 109, which says that 10 years after the UN is established, we will review the Charter. And what does that mean? And I think, again, we have to look into the history. In January 1946, the first session of the General Assembly, the leader of the Indian delegation who signed the UN Charter, Sir Ramaswamy Mudalia, a politician, he made the speech for India, and he said that this was a safeguard measure which was unwillingly, and I quote the word unwillingly, given by India, on the understanding that 10 years from 1945, that is 1955, the charter provisions would be reviewed. And it's unfortunate that till today, the charter provisions have not been reviewed under this compromise that was worked out in 1945. So equal participation is the core message behind the references that you made to Minister Jaishankar's remarks and other people who have been talking about multilateral institutions having to be reformed to reflect the realities of today. I think the core of that is equal participation in the way decisions are taken.
I want to go to a point that you made, which I think most people either don't know or know very perfunctorily. There is a lot of academic and otherwise debate about reparations from Britain for wealth that was taken from India during the colonial period. You are essentially saying, apart from that, there were sovereign holdings in the UK, both for India and Egypt, that were used in the war efforts in the Second World War, which at the very least were legitimately due to India and Egypt, of course. On India's part, you're saying that sovereign holding would be worth as much as 45% of the Marshall Plan. That's a huge amount of money. That was never given back to India. How is it that this isn't a bigger issue, Ambassador?
Well, it was not given back when India asked for it during the negotiations that created the International Monetary Fund. India asked for this money because the negotiators, apart from the British gentleman who led the delegation, Mr. Reisman, the other negotiators were Indians. There was C.D. Deshmukh, who was governor of the Reserve Bank of India. There was the A.D. Shroff, who is one of the authors of the Bombay Plan. And these people, and Shanmugam Shetty, the first finance minister of independent India, these were the three. And they asked for the money because they wanted to finance the Bombay Plan. And this was the money that they had in mind would be available for 15 years for India to implement the Bombay Plan. But this point, of course, in the discussions today is more or less forgotten. So what happened was that because the primary thrust in the negotiations on the IMF creation was between the British and the Americans. There's a whole literature on that. In the process of that negotiation, the demand of India and Egypt for including the sterling balances in the outcome of the IMF negotiations was pushed to one side, and instead an Anglo-American agreement was negotiated, which prioritized the special relationship between the United States and United Kingdom. The United Kingdom then took advantage of that to make paying back the sterling balances a lesser priority. They did pay back the sterling balances, but using a rate of exchange at that time which favored them and effectively diluted the value of the money. But more important was the fact that this money was never made available as a corpus for the Bombay Plan. That is the crucial part, because the Bombay Plan was a plan for the development of India.
This history in mind, which actually most people don't know, and it's not much in public domain at all, or in public discourse, keeping this history in mind, reflect a little bit, Ambassador, on the current state of these institutions. Many people, many politicians today openly say that the UN system has failed. Politicians in America say this. Increasingly, politicians in Africa are saying it. And that this system does not serve the interest of a large number of its constituents. It serves the interest of only a handful of countries, and that goes for many global institutions. Reflect a bit on this and on how the equity or the equalness, so to speak, between countries and the benefits they acquire from the system as it exists today.
Well, I think that when you look at the functioning of the system, you'll have to disaggregate it into at least two pillars where this is visible. The criticism that is made of the system is a valid, legitimate criticism as far as the pillar of peace and security is concerned. And in peace and security, the reason the system has not functioned effectively is seen to be diluted is because of the stranglehold given to 5 countries in the Security Council, who gave themselves the power to disagree with any decision they didn't like, and they called it the concurrent vote of veto power. And it was never negotiated in the treaty, but it was inserted into the treaty, as I explained, as a condition for participating in the conference. So until that privilege or the power of these 5 countries is addressed head-on, the reform and restructuring of and revitalization of the political pillar of the United Nations system cannot take place. And we see it in increasingly. The statistic that I often give is when we negotiated in 2015 Agenda 2030 on Sustainable Development, the UN figures reported 60 million people were impacted by violent conflicts that were on the agenda of the UN Security Council. Last year in December, that figure is 314 million people. So there's a huge jump from 60 to 314 in these 7 years. And the reason is the Security Council is unable to resolve conflicts or even to enforce its own decisions. In the conflict in Ukraine, for example, it's amazing for people who have worked inside the system to find a unanimous UN Security Council resolution 2202 adopted in February 2015, which prioritizes the political settlement of the situation in Ukraine and guarantees Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. That's the resolution. And it's a unanimous resolution. The question today is, why has that resolution never been raised by the Security Council and enforced? After all, the Charter gives the Security Council two big levers to enforce its decisions: economic sanctions or military force. No other organ in the United Nations has that enforcement power. But the Security Council has kept quiet, has glossed over it, and therefore allowed that to go out, causing the misery and destruction that we see in the battlefield. So that's just an example. I mean, closer to home, we have Afghanistan, another unanimous resolution, 2513 of March 2020, saying that there will be a politically inclusive government in Kabul when NATO forces withdraw. So NATO forces withdrew, but without a politically inclusive government. And what did the Security Council do? It ignored its unanimous resolution. It didn't enforce it. So we have a situation where 20 million Afghan women are without right to employment, right to education. So this is a problem which is created by the Security Council and the way it takes decisions or doesn't take decisions. So that's the political pillar. But on the economic pillar, I would say the glass is the other way around, because that decision making in economic multilateralism has always taken place on the basis of one country, one vote. There is no veto power in the economic pillar. In the United Nations Charter, there is an economic and social pillar, which in 2006 was further refined into an economic and social pillar and a human rights pillar. The UN Human Rights Council was created in 2006 by the UN General Assembly. So in both these dimensions of what I call the socio-economic pillar of the United Nations, decisions are taken on the basis of one country, one vote, if there's no consensus. So very often there is consensus, so there's no need to have any vote. But the system has worked because it has been operated in a democratic, transparent, accountable manner. And that is the reason why the impact of multilateral institutions following the economic and social path of multilateralism has been so visible. I mean, we have had, for example, the Green Revolution, FAO, the work of eradicating polio, WHO, the counter to HIV/AIDS, again, WHO, UNAIDS, and so on. I mean, there has been a steady movement forward with visible results on the ground in the economic and social aspect of multilateralism. That is not seen in the political aspect, except for an area which is outside the Security Council. And that is the area which is in the General Assembly of the United Nations. And the biggest achievement in that area in the last 78 years has been the process of decolonization. When the UN was created, most countries which are independent members of the General Assembly today were colonies, the vast majority of them. 750 million people were under colonial rule in 1945. Independence of India set in motion a process of decolonization. And by 1963, the General Assembly membership had a majority of newly independent former colonial countries. And it was these countries that forced the General Assembly into its first amendment of the UN Charter to expand the Security Council in December that year. And it was not an issue on which there was consensus. So a vote was called for. And the vote had to be carried by a two-thirds majority because it required amending the UN Charter. But the majority being of developing countries, of newly independent former colonial countries, the majority was achieved. And 97 out of 113 members of the UN General Assembly voted in favor of amending the Charter, and the resolution was adopted. Then, of course, the next question was that in the Charter, there's a requirement that the 5 permanent members must all themselves individually agree to implement the resolution. And I think that I was giving the example of 1963 and the way in which the General Assembly took a vote by two-third majority to amend the charter and expand the number of elected seats from six, as it was in 1945, to 10. So there have been 10 seats in the UN Security Council since 1965 December. So this is an example of how the General Assembly has been able to work in the political pillar to create a structural balance, if I may call it that, to offset both the imbalance of the Charter of 1945 June, which was dominated by the four military powers. They call themselves the four policemen. I mean, that's a phrase which is used in their literature of the Republic of China, of France, United Kingdom, USSR, and UK. So they are the five policemen. France was brought in by the UK. So that did not change because of the review, which was promised 10 years after 45. It changed only because of the activism in the political assembly of the General UN, which is the General Assembly, where a recorded vote is. So that's the kind of outputs that democratization, use of one country, one vote can make. And that is the reason why many of us, starting from 1979, when India and a group of 9 countries put on the agenda of the General Assembly the question of equitable representation in the Security Council. That is the reason why we seek equitable representation, because the experience between 1965 and 1979 was clear that your representation may have expanded by 4 seats, but your ability to influence decisions taken by the council had not expanded at all because of the veto. So the question was to address the veto. And because it was still in the middle of the Cold War, the Assembly agreed to put the issue on the agenda in 1979 in November, but it took it up to discuss only after the Cold War ended in 1992. And between 1992 and 2005, these discussions were informal. There was nothing going on except that everybody was giving their point of view. And it was, as today we say, a unipolar moment. So there were not even so many points of view. There were the points of view of developing countries, a large number of them, who had themselves were trying to find a new identity, because one of the raison d'etre of the non-aligned movement was the Cold War. So what happens to these countries after the Cold War ended? That is a question which is still playing out. And the countries which held the power were consolidated in the Washington moment. I mean, in that unipolar world. And it was only in 2005 that this process came to a head with a very interesting initiative taken by Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations at that time, when the UN was meeting to mark its 60th anniversary. So 60 years after 1945. And he tried to finesse the demand for one country, one vote in the Security Council by proposing that a group of 6 countries should be invited as permanent members of the Security Council. These were the G4, that is Brazil, Japan, Germany, and India, and 2 from Africa. Now, he could not specify, he himself was from Africa. He knew the political discussions within the African structure, Organization of African Unity, later the African Union. And he knew that they had a certain viewpoint which was codified later in the Sitte Declaration, which says that the African Union itself will decide which are the permanent members which should sit in the Security Council. So he initiated this, and what happened was that because there was no agreement on the 2 African names, the initiative then became open-ended. The thought was there that the Security Council had to be reformed. The 5 permanent members agreed with that thought in 2005, but they accepted it on paper because they knew there was, if I may call it, divide and rule at work. I mean, there was no unity among the other side. So there's an interesting paragraph in the summit outcome of 2005, It's a very short paragraph, 153, which says that the world leaders unanimously call for early reform of the Security Council to make it more representative, to make it more effective, and to ensure the implementation of its decisions on the ground. So the reason for its reform the Security Council is known and on paper since 2005 September. And then the story goes into a phase which is the current phase of how the permanent members have worked heaven and earth. They've moved to prevent this from being implemented, this mandate.
I want to
And
ask you,
that is another story.
and with that we can come to a cut to the present, so to speak. And my question to you is, a lot of the G20, and even before the G20, India's G20 summit, there was this entire point about the global South coming together. And the global South, in a sense, is back in conversation, right? We used to, I guess there was a time when it used to be called the developing world. Now it's called the global South. And the global South has its own priorities. Now, these priorities are becoming clearer and clearer with COVID. We've seen what happened in the pandemic, how vaccinations and vaccines were kept away from parts of the global South. We're seeing it in the economic disparity. We are now going to see this very starkly in the lack of availability of climate finance to make the successful climate transition in many parts of the global South, because the finance that's needed is just not available, or the political will to make that finance available is largely absent in the global North, even though the emissions problem has really, if one could say so, has emitted from the global North. All of these issues make it very critical for a certain equity to come into the global order, but this equity is missing largely. Talk us through on how you think this equity could be achieved and the role India could play.
The equity, of course, has to be achieved by having an equal place at the table where decisions are taken. On the issues that you have mentioned of climate finance, we need a place at the table. The table in the case of financial flows in the multilateral system is through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Now, the problem is in the International Monetary Fund, the structure for taking decisions is that created in 1944 when the IMF negotiations ended, and 1945 when the IMF itself got created. And that structure is weighted in favor of quotas given on the economic profile of the countries of 1945. Now, as I said, most of the countries that are independent sovereign members of the multilateral system today were colonies in 1945, and therefore they have no role or no share of these quotas. The quotas were dominated by the industrialized countries. The Soviet Union walked out of the IMF, so whatever quota it would have had didn't come. So that's how it happened. And India had a share in the quotas. India, I think, in the articles of 1945, if you look at it, is number 6 in that list. After the 5 top Western countries, India is number 6. But India's own problems, as I tried to explain, were linked with not getting the kind of money that India had available back into India for development. Be that as it may. The point here is the countries, the developing countries, which people are now calling the global South, need an equal participation in the decision-making process. And today, through the G20, there is a different criteria which is now being accepted by the industrialized countries, which is to look at emerging economies. So the G20 is composed today of industrialized G7 economies and the rest emerging economies. And that's how this sort of framework has been created by these political summits that have taken place since 2008 onwards. So it's the emerging countries who need to have a greater place and more equal participation in the decisions to be taken by the multilateral financial institutions. Now, the IMF had agreed to reform its quotas to rebalance, as it called it, the quotas in 2010 after after the global financial crisis of 2008, when a lot of emerging markets pooled together and contributed to an IMF bailout package to bail out companies in the West. The IMF agreed at its meeting in Singapore in 2010 to rebalance the quotas. It is really sad that between 2010 and this year, that has not been implemented at all. In fact, they're going to have a review of that decision in December this year. And the way it's going, it will be pushed up to 2025, 2 years later. So, emerging economies are not going to have an equal say in the decisions of the IMF on how financing flows will take place. And as you pointed out, the financial flows, I mean, there was a time last year when some of us were quite surprised that even a country in the middle of a conflict was being given access to IMF finances, that is Ukraine. Whereas a country in conflict is not never included in IMF financing. So this shows how decisions are taken. Many emerging economies may have nothing against that, but the point is that it has to be applied as a standard equally to all countries, and it is not. And the countries which are in the developing world, which are facing conflicts, normally do not have access to finance from the IMF. So this is something that illustrates the kind of problem that we face. Now, there is a new American Indian president of the World Bank, Mr. Ajay Banga. The expectation in the developing world is that he understands, being himself from having studied in the developing world and knowing the developing world, that he will make a difference. But I think that the ability of a single individual to make a difference in a system which is dominated by the holders of capital is not so simple. And I think that even with the best of efforts, he will need a lot of support from emerging markets to restructure the system in the World Bank in order to deliver.
I also want to talk a little bit with you in what really happened in the G20 summit, which touches upon many of the themes that you mentioned. Even in the coming together of the communique, many people believed right up till the last date that this was not going to be possible. Now, today, there is a lot of debate on whether India brought it all together and made it happen, or the West was benevolent, whether America was generous, and so on and so forth. But the question and the big point of the whole thing is there was a real sense that if this communique does not come together, then the validity of the G20 as an institution would be under question, and that therefore, the Chinese taking advantage of that situation to put other institutions in the limelight and in the forefront instead of institutions like the G20 cannot be ruled out. In fact, would inevitably happen. Talk us through a little bit about the China threat. Because it seems to be, and please correct me if I'm wrong, many of the issues that you're talking about today are under more pressure than ever because there is a palpable China threat that the West, especially America, feels.
Yeah. So on the China point, I think that when we look at the way the issues in the G20 agenda are to be taken forward, we have to look at it, of course, through the prism of both the G7 and the prism of China, these being the major presences in the G20 room. But when we look at China, I think we need to be careful on China as a player in the financial pillar and China as a player in the trade pillar. In the trade pillar, they are, I think, much more flexible because they have less quote unquote power that full-fledged members of the WTO have. And I think that that is already evident in the way the Chinese and the European Union have got together to try and cobble together some kind of alternate dispute settlement system, which has been atrophied in the WTO by the United States. So this is something that we must keep in mind. I mean, it's not a monolithic single Chinese influence. It's of different kinds. But the point that you're making, I think, is important because the flows of finance for meeting the objectives of the G20 agenda, especially climate finance, but also in other sectors of Agenda 2030, these flows need a concerted effort. And I think that the reason why the G20 had to come up with a declaration is as much due to the vested interest of the owners of capital, which is within the G7, of making sure that their money is giving them returns as through the G20 activities, as it is for the politics of international relations, of having the countries of the global south on board, etc., etc. At the core of it, of this decision, continues to be the vision that created the globalized world. Now, there's a challenge to that vision, and I think it's important that we talk about it, because the challenge to the vision is what we explained in the first part of this conversation today, that we have to have equal participation. Otherwise, we are always contributing and getting nothing. I mean, the question in India would be, we gave more than $10 billion to the IMF to bail out Western companies in 2010-11. What did we get? We never even got the readjustment of the quota weightage governance system of the IMF, and it's been so long. But look at how China leveraged. China also contributed money, but China in the financial pillar is sitting as part of the owners of capital. And I think that is something that we need to recognize, because that makes us different. They are, and they've generated a lot of their progress and their economic growth on the back of their membership of multilateral institutions, which is why they say that they are always, when you hear President Xi Jinping speak, he speaks of China as a defender of multilateralism. Now, if there are inequities in the multilateral system, then surely China should be among the first to take an initiative to resolve this inequity. The inequity between countries, like I was talking about in the political pillar, of seeking one country, one vote in Security Council. But no, China doesn't take any initiative. In fact, China blocks an initiative in the political pillar for equity. So, it's a vested interest. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. But there's an attempt, and there is an expectation that if countries and states cannot finance through multilateral institutions, then financing must come from private entities and private bodies. Now, this is a brave new world. We do not know how these entities, bodies operate. The G20 has tried for many years to create some kind of oversight framework, regulatory framework on taxation, etc., all of which have gone nowhere, because there is no interest among the owners of capital to surrender any of their privileges which they acquired after the Second World War. And I think that's a big conversation which has to take place.
One last question, Ambassador, which is, where does India fit in all this? Now that, it has conducted a very successful G20 summit, there is a palpable sense that India's weightage, should I say, using an economic phraseology in the world, is distinctly rising. India for years has argued that it should have a rightful permanent place in the Security Council. Every other country, apart from China, seems to agree that India should have that place, but it's clearly not happening. What should India do next?
So what India needs to do is to approach it with an objective of having a review of the entire multilateral system that was created in 1945, which is possible through a general conference of to review the UN Charter, which has been proposed by the Secretary General's Advisory Board. So I think that should be the objective. How India should work towards that objective is to take a leaf out of the G20 summit preparations that India did. For example, soon after the Prime Minister said that in the G20, India will of course reflect the views of other members, but also countries which are outside the G20 who belong to the Global South. In December, that was the first time he used the word Global South in the context of G20 in his remarks. And in January, India convened the virtual summit of the Voice of the Global South with 125 countries, including 47 from Africa. And so, therefore, I think that is the disaggregated approach that India needs to take, because you cannot expect this to be decided now in a room only of the G7, China, and India. This decision on how to make multilateralism reflect the realities of the world of today needs to have a broader participation and broader, more effective participation. And if India is by the end of this year opening embassies in all the countries of the African Union, then I think the priority for these embassies would be to have these dialogues with their host countries to make sure that when the UN meets for its Summit of the Future next year in September 2024, then these countries where India has accredited its ambassadors would be able to support and contribute to the view to reform multilateralism, the way India is suggesting multilateralism should be reformed. Because in this matrix, India is the odd man out. The G7 have their own stakes. They have their seats at the table. China has its seat at the table. India is the country which doesn't have a seat at the table. So we have to operate through another structure, and that is the structure of what we have called the Global South. It is not a structure that is based on any treaty or based on any agreement. There is no agreement on what is the Global South. It is a approach, and the approach is, as I think our Prime Minister has put it in those two words, it's a human-centric approach. So that differentiates us from the other two, because even for technology, we are prioritizing the human-centric nature of technology over the patent protection, as you saw in the COVID vaccine, or intellectual property right, or state control, as you see in China. I mean, we have a different approach to technology. And I think that is one of the biggest calling cards that India has put on the table. It put it on the table in the Vaccine Maitri initiative, the COVID vaccine. It gave us such returns, which the global audience heard foreign ministers of these countries speak at the UN about the impact, the positive impact of the Vaccine Maitri initiative. But similarly with digital public infrastructure, one of the major outcomes of the G20 summit, the agreement of the G20 to consider using the DPI, the digital public infrastructure, as a template and to create principles for how it is to be used. Now, this is something that India should prioritize after the G20 summit, because India has the experience to suggest the principles, to suggest the way the norms can be, and also to suggest how it can remain human-centric. Because the biggest danger is all these ideas then get cannibalized by the other two stakeholders in this process, the G7 and China, for their own purposes. And we are left with the rest of the countries of the world, which are in the Global South, to fend for ourselves. So that should not happen.
Note, Ambassador, thanks very much for explaining this really intricate process of India finally trying to get a seat at the table. Very clearly, a lot of churn is happening in the global order, and one hopes that India will be able to acquire its rightful position with the right kind of diplomatic endeavors. Thanks very much, Ambassador Mukerji, for joining me in this conversation. Thanks very much, sir.
Thank you, Hindol. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.